Pat, thank you very much. Please, thank you. Thank you. Mr. President, thank you for the opportunity to allow Senators Blumenthal, Murphy, and Esty to host this conference or this meeting here today. And I say to Dan, to Governor Malloy, Governor, would it be that every governor in the country acted as swiftly, decisively, and as courageously as you have? And I mean that sincerely. Dan and I have been meeting, the governor and I should say, the governor and I have been meeting from almost the week after this happened. He's been to Washington a number of times. But you know, I had a grandpa named Ambrose Finnegan. He used to say, you know, he used to say, what the hell's so funny about that?
I bet them that you would talk about your grandfather.
I love my grandfather. And my grandfather was a very wise man. He was brilliant, not just because he was Irish, but he used to say, all kidding aside, he used to say, you know, in times of crisis, America gets lucky. What happens is the right people seem to be in the right spot. Well, I tell you, I've been around a long time. I'm the guy who wrote the first assault weapons ban. I wrote the Biden crime bill, the thing to put 100,000 cops in the street. I got elected when I was 72 as a 29-year-old kid. But I've never seen an array of officials who are as committed and talented, and I mean this sincerely, as what is called for and needed right now, right at this moment, and right in this state. You know, you got a former Attorney General. You know, I don't want to turn this into a mutual admiration stuff, but you got an Attorney General who was the Chief Law Enforcement Officer for years and years in the state, who's now in the Senate at a moment on the committee that is of consequence, that where he is, as old joke goes, down my way, he's forgotten more about this issue than most people will know. You've got a young new guy who feels it in his blood, in his bones, in his, I mean, the passion with which he brings to this debate in the Congress. Chris has just been relentless, and then, you know, Elizabeth, I think that my guess is the people of your district and the people of Newtown not only appreciate your talent, your competence, but you just have a way. You have a way of bringing a sense of. I think it matters. People know how much you care about this, and it matters. And so I want to thank them for hosting this and for inviting me. And you know, and by the way, Jim Himes is here. Jim, poor Jim has met me before, and we ended up on Bill's mantle in the same picture. So I don't know whether he's going to be able to live it down. But you know, I say this, and I know there's a lot of press here, a lot of press. I say this with every ounce of sincerity that I can muster, that really the class of the field in our administration is the guy you just heard from, Arne Duncan. He's a guy who's taken this job as a Secretary of Education with an absolute commitment and passion to education and protecting kids. This is the guy who was a great basketball player at Harvard, played professional basketball in Australia. This is the guy who came back, could have done anything he wanted, and he went and he worked in the South Side of Chicago in a tutoring program for kids in real trouble. Then ended up running the Chicago school system, and you could tell, you could tell, and I could watch your eyes by the timbre of his voice, how strongly he feels about this and how deep it goes. Because, folks, the one thing I think all of you, I hope you believe, I believe, there is much we can do. There is much we can do. The thing that is most frustrating but understandable is in many cases around, I travel all around the country, is the sense of hopelessness. People say, well, how are we going to deal with any of this? And I get asked on the shows I do and these large audiences, I get asked about, well, what's the one thing? What's the one thing that can be done? There is no one thing to be done. When you say that, people get a sense like, God, then there's no answer. There are multiple things that can and must be done, totally within our power, totally within our control, that will fundamentally alter the situation we find ourselves in. Ladies and gentlemen, I should have begun by saying, and I had a chance to meet with two of the parents for half an hour before they had to leave. I'm going to meet with those of you who are willing to meet with me afterwards, and I met with an awful lot of you already. And but you know, I say to all of you, I genuinely admire your courage. And I think I understand a little bit about it. You know, this is not easy for you, because sitting here listening to the speakers and just being in this room knowing the subject causes you to relive the moment. Having lost a child and a wife in a sudden burst of not gunfire but a truck. You have a hell of a lot more courage than I had. And we owe you a debt of gratitude for being willing to stay in the ring. You know, so I say to all of you, once again, my heart goes out to you. I deeply admire your courage. And quite frankly, having tried it myself, I can't imagine how you did it. I didn't have the courage to do what you're doing. I can't imagine it. But there's one thing I can imagine. I can imagine how we will be judged as a society if we do nothing. I can imagine that. I can predict that, what will be written of us 20 and 30 years from now if we don't act. When I think about all the courage you've shown, it's not too much to ask the political establishment of this country, the members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, state legislators, governors, to show some political courage too. You know? When the president called me in, and we have lunch once a week together where there's nothing on the agenda, and he said, Joe, look, he said, you don't have to do this if you don't want, but I'd like you to lead this effort. And the way he said it was a reflection of what sort of the standing assumption is in American politics today, that this is kind of a third rail of politics, that if you take this on, somehow there will be a severe political price to pay for doing it, because that's what's happened in the past. That's what's happened in the past. People say, and you read, and people write about the political risk and why they're unacceptable to take on. I say it's unacceptable not to take these on. It's just simply unacceptable. It is not something we cannot fail to do. So I say, and every one of these people on the stage have done that. But what I say to my colleagues who will watch this and listen to this, I say to you, if you're concerned about your political survival, you should be concerned about the survival of our children. And guess what? I believe the price to be paid politically to those who refuse to act, who refuse to step forward. Because America has changed on this issue. You should all know the American people are with us. They should know. You all should know there's a moral price to be paid for inaction. And ladies and gentlemen, the organized opposition, the same opposition that I've been involved with for 40 years of my career, and my law enforcement friends have been as well. They've thrown up question after question. Not because they're looking for answers, but not because they're driven by facts, not because they're looking for a way forward, because they're looking for roadblocks. So every one of these chats I do on the internet, every one of these things I do on Facebook, it's amazing some of the questions that seep in. They say, all you're going to do, Biden, you and the president, you're going to deny law-abiding citizens their rights under the Second Amendment. Not true. They say assault weapons. They say assault weapons like the AR-15 are needed for self-protection and recreation. They are not. There's plenty of ways you can protect yourself and recreate without an AR-15. They say it isn't about guns. They're wrong. It is about guns. And let me say at the outset to all the press, no law-abiding citizen in the United States of America has any fear that their constitutional rights will be infringed in any way. None. Zero. Look, common sense facts are these assault weapons are unnecessary and dangerous weapons that put our law enforcement personnel at risk. You guys know a lot of departments around the country. I've been working with the police agency for 35 years. I'm going to say something outrageous. You had no better friend over the last 35 years than me. And what do I hear from you all? I hear from one community to another. You're being outgunned. They're being outgunned. It's not just about protecting the community. It's about protecting the people who protect the community as well. Look. Then I hear them say, well, it's about our culture. The facts are our culture's not killing 25 people today. It's weapons with high-capacity magazines. It's criminals who get guns without going through a background check. I also get told, they say there are too many of these weapons out there already, so why do anything about putting more out? The ban will have no effect. That's certainly no argument to continue to proliferate weapons we don't think are healthy in society. For the president and me, it's a simple proposition. Tragically highlighted by what happened in Newtown. We can't remain silent. We have to speak for all those voices. We have to speak for those 20 beautiful children who died 69 days ago, 12 miles from here. They can't speak for themselves. We have to speak for the voice of those 6 adults who died trying to save the children in their care that day who can't speak for themselves. You have to speak for the 1,900 people who have died at the other end of the gun just since Sandy Hook in this country. 1,900 just since that day. They can no longer speak for themselves. Caitlin Cornett, a 20-year-old Kentucky woman, shot and killed in a college parking lot after a domestic dispute. Aiden Perea, a 4-year-old boy, probably just learning how to tie his shoes, who was caught in a drive-by shooting in Kansas City. Hydra Pendleton, a 15-year-old Chicago girl, who the president and I literally watched pass the reviewing stand in front of the White House as a majorette on Inauguration Day, shot dead in a park near her school. Arnie Neuver, an honor student, a kid played in the band. The kid was both her parents were college educated. She was working like hell. She went to the park and sitting on a swing. 12 noon. Janae McFarland was gunned down just hours before her sister joined President Barack Obama for a gun safety event in Chicago. You all saw that on television. 25 people dead from gun homicides every day in this country, and it doesn't count the scores of mothers, sons, daughters, whose lives have been irrevocably altered. Folks, let me say this as clearly as I can. There are going to be a lot of voices in this debate, but I am absolutely determined, the president is absolutely determined, that the loudest voices will be for the voices of the people who lost their voice. They will be the loudest voices in this debate. We intend to speak for them. Enough is enough. We have an obligation to act. And we are taking that obligation seriously, responsibly, and we're acting expeditiously. When the president asked me to do this, I put together a format. We met with every possible stakeholder in this debate. 229 separate groups, not individuals, groups we met with. Governors, mayors, county executives, law enforcement officers, mental health experts, survivors of gun violence, religious groups, sporting organizations, the NRA, the gun owners groups, representatives from the movie and video game industries. And there's a generic consensus, not unanimity, a consensus that is different than existed when I did this back in 1992 and 93 to get to the 94 bill. The consensus is emerging. There's a consensus in the types of action everybody thinks are reasonable we should take. I prepared for the president a document reflecting that consensus, as he asked me to do, backed up by the best data available. And the conclusions we reached were as follows. First, we need universal background check system. Universal. Every single weapon sold. Up to 40% of the guns that are currently purchased through private sales that don't require background checks. If we change that, we can help significantly reduce the number of guns that end up in the wrong hands. We need to make sure that states who have all the records of the felons in their state, all the records of the fugitives in their state, all the records of those who are adjudicated mentally incapable of owning a gun in their state. But there's tens of thousands, probably, we don't know the exact number, millions of those records that never get to the national database. So when you go to Dick's Sporting Goods store to buy a weapon, buy a gun, and your name gets run through, you may be a convicted felon in Montana, Delaware, New York, Connecticut, Florida, and your name never comes up, so you're sold the gun. Second, we can improve safety if we limit, not eliminate, limit high-capacity magazines. Mark Kelly, a friend of mine, Gabby Gifford's husband, pointed out that if the shooter in Tucson had a 10-round magazine instead of a 30-round magazine, little granddaughter of a friend of mine from Wilmington, Delaware, who used to manage the Philadelphia Phillies, she'd be alive today. Because when changing his magazine, a woman leaned over in the crowd and knocked his arm, and that's how they subdued him. It makes a difference. Wouldn't have saved everybody. Wouldn't have saved everybody. But the last two people shot would be alive. There's no rational reason why someone ought to be able to carry a 100-round drum like the Aurora shooter carried. What rationale for that? And how does that affect his constitutional right if he's denied the right to have a 100-round drum? Third, we can reduce gun violence if we reiterate and strengthen the assault weapons ban. Cops are being outgunned. 37% of police agencies, people on the front lines, reported in a report in 2010 survey that they did that they saw an increase in the criminal use of assault weapons after the ban expired in 2004. Fourth, we need a federal gun trafficking statute. Most of you think there probably is one. There is no federal gun trafficking statute. And the reason why it's so important is how we can make sure the prosecutors can go after the so-called straw purchasers. So many of these weapons that are getting into hands illegally are bought by people who can pass the background check. They buy in bulk and they go from store to store to store, and then they resell or they get paid for doing that by criminal organizations or individuals. A federal gun trafficking law would allow us to get at that more clearly and other things I won't bore you with. Fifth, we can reduce gun violence if there are more sworn law enforcement officers on the street. Dick remembers back when I first wrote the crime bill, put 100,000 cops in the street in the Clinton administration. Everybody said, no, we tried that. We never did that before. And we turned it to community policing. Gun murders dropped precipitously since we passed that law in '94. And now what's happening? We got lucky here with Mike being able to help him, but we got stymied in continuing to fund the cops bill the way we should, the cops program. And so you have roughly, I think it's 17,000 shields that are authorized to be had in communities all across America sitting in a drawer because of the recession has absolutely crushed the ability to maintain law enforcement sizes. In cities like Camden, New Jersey, they're basically eliminating their police department. Flint, Michigan, significant cuts. So we call for funding back those 15,000 law enforcement officers who lost their job because of the recession in the name of public health and public interest. Sixth, we should encourage, not prevent, serious research on gun violence. You say, well, don't you do that already, Joe? After, when we passed, in order to get the legislation passed in '94 that I had written, we had to agree that it had to be reauthorized in 10 years, along with the Violence Against Women Act, which they're holding up now, which I wrote. Which baffles me, but anyway. And so, 2004, in the last administration, they decided not to try to reauthorize it. We didn't have votes to reauthorize it. A little known fact went along with now eliminating the magazine limits and the assault and ban and a few other things. They began to attach what we call in the parlance of Washington, the Congress, riders to appropriations bills, explicitly preventing the federal agencies with the expertise from being able to keep any records on gun violence and study gun violence. So the CDC down in Atlanta, Georgia, is prohibited by law until the president acted with executive order to do studies on gun violence. The National Institutes of Health are not able to do them. It reminded me, and excuse me for elongating this, it reminded me when I was a young senator in '73 as a 30-year-old kid. My state was a big auto producer, and I remember the chairman of the board of the major auto companies wanted to come to see me, and I was very flattered. And I found out that what they wanted to do is they wanted to keep a ban on the National Highway Safety Council being able to keep records on auto fatalities. I couldn't quite figure that one out. Ralph Nader had just written a book in '69 called Unsafe at Any Speed. Well, guess why? I didn't agree, fortunately, and the ban was lifted, and guess what you found out? They found out everybody thought people died because they got thrown through, passengers because they got thrown through the front windshield and thrown out of the car. They died because they hit their heads on the post and fractured their skulls. And what did that mean? It means that we came along and said you got to have a shoulder restraint. That costs money. Everybody didn't realize until you did the studies that the vast majority of people dying in the driver's killed by the steering column. Cost money, but we did it. Said you have to have one that can collapse. And the list goes on. There's a reason why they didn't want those to be able to have all those facts. Why do you think the NRA doesn't want us to be able to study these issues? Ladies and gentlemen, this includes getting serious studies done on what effect, if any, violent video games and media have on childhood development and behavior. We don't have any hard studies. We can't make a judgment, and there may be none. But in an informed society, we shouldn't be afraid of the facts. The seventh thing we should do is make our schools safer. This includes giving communities the option of having a school resource officer. In the so-called Biden crime bill in '94, there were 100,000 cops. They also included school resource officers. And you could apply in a community to have a law enforcement, a sworn shield, not a rent-a-cop, as they say, in your school. And the reason for that was we found out that the students got to know the law enforcement officer and would start to confide in him. They'd say, by the way, there's going to be a drug deal going down after school. This is going to happen because kids don't want to have to go to the principal or go to the teachers to say those things. Well, they're not around anymore. So what we did this time was, the President and I are proposing to begin funding school resource officers, but if a community decides it rather would have, instead of a shield in the hallway or in the gymnasium, would rather have hire a school psychologist or an extra counselor, they should have the option to do that with the same money we're providing. We also propose training teachers and administrators. My wife is a full-time teacher. She says 15 credits a semester as a second lady. She's not stopped teaching. I don't mention the years anymore, but for a long time. And, you know, the answer isn't to arm our teachers. The answer is to arm our teachers with information so they can recognize the warning signs of serious mental illness in a way that we train them in first aid, not for them to act, but for them to then direct that child to the parent and those parents to the help that may be available. It includes developing best practice for preventing and responding to mass shootings so that, God forbid, there's a shooter on campus, everyone knows what to do and how to limit the damage. And finally, we should make mental health services available, especially for young people. We know the people between the ages of 16 and 25 are at a very high risk of mental illness. That's the riskiest time. We also know they're among the least likely to seek help or be able to get help. We need to fix that. And I believe we can. We need to make sure that we have enough mental health professionals on the job. When I met with all the medical associations around the country, they pointed out that the mental health experts and docs from around the country heard again and again, there are not enough mental health providers in our communities, even if people want to seek the help. So we are proposing to train more than 5,000 mental health professionals with the specific skills they'll need to serve young people in our schools and our communities, in the same way we have before by incentivizing them for tuition and a whole range of things to be able to do that. We also know that when kids leave school, too often they fall through the cracks when it comes to getting mental help for their mental illness. That's why we proposed a new initiative to let states try innovative ways to make sure those young people get the help they need or they had been getting that they lose once they get out of school. But understanding you need help isn't the only thing. Too often insurance companies don't provide quality coverage for mental health services. We're working to change that. Through the President's leadership, we've already expanded access to mental health treatment for millions of people through the Affordable Care Act. In fact, just this week, our administration put forward a new regulation around that law that will ensure that 62 million additional Americans will get quality mental health coverage. And later this year, we'll put in place the mental health parity regulations that will expand mental health coverage to millions of people. We fought for a long, long time to get that. In 2008, it finally passed, mental health parity, that you're entitled to coverage for a mental health problem just as you surely are for a broken arm. And we also need a broad discussion in this country about mental illness. Your former Senator Chris Dodd is moving to help us on that front by going out and convincing the entertainment industry to do what they can do best, do PSAs that are real, encouraging people to seek mental health so that it is no longer a stigma. Those of you who were served in the military recently, as my son coming back from Iraq, the military is now focused on that. They don't let you just leave Iraq or Afghanistan and come home. You go back and you're essentially you're deprogrammed for 4 days because they're taught to be tough guys and women to be able to shoot and kill. And they have problems. They have nightmares. They have dreams. Their heads ache. They're frightened. But they're not about to say anything. Our military has figured out it's important to say to them and say, look, it's okay. Tell me. Tell me. You having bad dreams? Tell me. Are you frightened? Tell me. We got to do that. If the military figured that out, we ought to be able to figure that out. And because they're the best we have, that we ought to be able to make it clear to people the mental illness is not the stigma that it still contains. There's still a stigma, and we need to do away with it. Not just because it's fair or accurate, because it generally prevents kids from seeking treatment that could really help them. It prevents parents from seeking help for their children. And it could generally change their lives. These are the contours of our plans. These are some of the things we think we have to act on. But look, if we do all of these things, we can't guarantee there will not be another mass shooting in America. Even if we do all those things, we cannot guarantee another mother or father won't receive that dreaded phone call. And even if we do all those things, we know we can't save every single life. But we do know this, that these things, if we do them, will make life better, safer, and significantly fewer people will fall victim, as your kids did in Newtown. Fewer children will die. Fewer Futures will be stamped out. So, folks, we have to act. Even if we save the life of only one child, as the President says, I have no doubt that if we take the steps proposed, we'll save many more lives. And here's the critical point. Without infringing on anyone's constitutional right under the Second Amendment, without infringing on anyone's constitutional right. And ladies and gentlemen, this time around, if you look at the polling data, the vast majority of the American people are with us. They know we have to act, and they're prepared. It's time. So with the grace of God and the goodwill of the neighbors, we ought to get this done, because now is the time to act. Thank you very, very much.